The London fog at the beginning of the 19th century was not merely a weather phenomenon, but a dense, almost tangible substance, concealing the capital's darkest secrets. In the dead of night, when gas lamps barely coped with the thick gloom, sounds emanated from old churchyards that would chill the blood of any Sluchini passerby. It was not the creak of branches or the howl of the wind, but the dull, rhythmic thud of a wooden spade against loose earth. Those who heard this sound quickened their pace, trying not to look towards the gravestones, for they knew there were people working there whose faces were best never seen. During these hours, while the city slept, a group of men in coarse clothing performed the inverse ritual of burial. They were not seeing off the departed on their last journey, but bringing them back into the world of the living, though in a completely different capacity. These were Resurrectionists, men of shadow, whose craft consisted of extracting recently buried bodies for the sake of scientific progress and jingling coin. Their work was shrouded in mystical horror, yet there was nothing supernatural about it, only cold calculation, physical strength, and a knowledge of anatomy that many medical students would envy. In the pockets of their coats, gold jingled, its price measured by the peace of the deceased and the grief of their relatives. In an era when medicine was taking giant strides forward, attempting to understand the structure of the human body, these nocturnal laborers became the invisible foundation of great discoveries. Every anatomical atlas of that time, every brilliant surgical operation that saved a life, had its dark prehistory, beginning with an unearthed grave and a pried-open coffin lid. It was the paradox of the Age of Enlightenment. The light of knowledge was kindled by a torch held in the hands of a criminal shadow. To understand how civilized society reached such a state, where body snatching became a flourishing industry, one must delve into the context of the time. Medicine of the 18th and early 19th centuries was undergoing a turbulent transformation. Doctors no longer contented themselves with ancient treatises and theoretical conjectures. Surgery demanded practice, precision, and a thorough knowledge of the arrangement of nerves, vessels, and organs. The only way to acquire this knowledge was through dissection of the human body. Anatomical theaters opened in every major hospital and university, attracting hundreds of ambitious students eager to unravel the mysteries of life. However, legislation hopelessly lagged behind the needs of science. According to the laws of that time, the only legal source of bodies for dissection were the bodies of criminals whose lives had been cut short by court sentence for particularly grave offenses. Judges, when pronouncing sentence, often added the clause about handing over the body to anatomists as an additional punishment, depriving the condemned of the right to a Christian burial. But the number of such sentences was negligibly small compared to the growing army of students. In one London anatomical school alone, up to 1,000 people could be studying, each requiring material for practice. The mathematics were relentless. For a few dozen legal bodies, there were thousands of minds hungry for knowledge. This imbalance provoked the birth of a black market whose scale was astonishing. Demand creates supply. And if the law does not allow obtaining what is needed legally, there will be those who will do so outside the law for appropriate remuneration. Thus, on the historical stage appeared the Resurrectionists, or, as the surgeons themselves called them, people who provide science with material. This was not just a group of marginalized individuals, but a well-organized professional caste with its own rules, hierarchy, and methods of work. They knew perfectly well that a human body was not its owner's property in the eyes of the law. Stealing clothes from the deceased was considered a serious crime, punishable by exile or long imprisonment, while the removal of the body itself fell into a quote, one of legislation and was considered only an offense against public morality. Therefore, professional body snatchers always left the shroud and clothing in the grave, taking only what had scientific value. This cynical legal nuance allowed them to avoid harsh punishment for years, balancing on the edge of imprisonment and fabulous earnings. The golden sovereign became the currency that decided the fate of the deceased. The cost of one body could range from 8 to 15 guineas, which was a huge sum for a common laborer whose weekly earnings barely reached 1 guinea. During periods of particular scarcity, or when bodies with rare pathologies were required, prices soared even higher. Surgeons and anatomists, being respected and wealthy individuals, paid these sums without hesitation, asking no unnecessary questions about the origin of the material. A strong, indissoluble link was established between the brilliant world of academic science and the dirty world of night cemeteries. Professors lectured in starched collars, scalpel in hand, while their silent assistants, who had only yesterday rested in the earth, were delivered through back doors under the cover of darkness. The organization of the Resurrectionists' work was perfected. They didn't just wander through cemeteries looking for fresh graves. They had an extensive network of informants, gravediggers, watchmen, funeral home attendants, and even servants in wealthy homes would, for a small fee, report on upcoming funerals. Of particular interest were burials in paupers' cemeteries, where security was weaker and graves were not as deep. However, even wealthy burials were not immune to visits from night guests. Resurrectionists developed a unique technique that allowed them to extract a body in less than 40 minutes, leaving the surface of the grave virtually untouched. They did not excavate the entire grave. Instead, a narrow tunnel was dug at the head of the grave down to the coffin. Then, using special tools, the top of the coffin lid was broken. The body was hooked with ropes or hooks by the shoulders and pulled to the surface, like a cork from a bottle. The earth was carefully returned to its place, and the turf was laid with jeweler's precision, so that in the morning, relatives who came to visit the grave noticed no changes. Only occasionally, if novices were working or the rush was too great, a tool or a piece of shroud left in haste could betray the terrible secret. This method required extraordinary physical strength and coordinated actions from the entire team. Typically, a group consisted of 3 or 4 people, 2 digging, 1 watching the surroundings, ready to signal if a patrol appeared, and the 4th tending to the cart on which the _2_ was delivered to the client. In London, entire gangs operated, having divided the city's territory among themselves. Competition was fierce, and clashes between rival groups often ended in brawls right among the tombstones. If one gang discovered that another was working in their territory, they could not only beat up their competitors, but also desecrate the grave in such a way as to cause a scandal and attract police attention, thereby burning the spot for their rivals. But the conflict was not only in the realm of competition between gangs. Far deeper was the confrontation between body snatchers and society. The fear of grave desecration became a real phobia for the residents of Britain. People feared not the fact of the body's disappearance itself, but the consequences this could have for the soul. According to religious beliefs of the time, the integrity of the body was important for resurrection on Judgment Day. The thought that a loved one's body would be cut into pieces and scattered throughout the anatomical theater horrified relatives. This spawned an entire industry of protecting the dead. Wealthy families ordered so-called patent coffins, with triple walls, complex locks, and metal fastenings that could not be quickly opened. Cemeteries turned into fortresses. Walls were raised, broken glass was scattered on top, and watchtowers were installed where armed guards stood duty. The most visually impressive manifestation of this struggle was the mortsafes, heavy iron cages or grills that were placed directly over the grave. These massive structures, weighing hundreds of kilograms, covered the burial site, making tunneling impossible. Huge stone slabs were also used, which were impossible to move without special equipment. Poor families, who could not afford such expensive devices, resorted to other methods. They mixed earth with straw and stones to make digging more difficult, or laid thorn branches over the coffin. The most common method of protection was night vigil. Relatives took turns sitting by the grave for 2 or 3 weeks until natural decomposition processes made the body unsuitable for anatomical purposes. However, the ingenuity of the body snatchers knew no bounds. They bribed watchmen, plied grave diggers with drink, or simply waited until the vigilance of relatives weakened. In this grim game of cat and mouse, the advantage was almost always on the side of the attackers, for they only needed to succeed once, while the defenders had to be constantly on guard. The inner world of the body snatchers themselves was no less complex. Many of them did not consider themselves criminals in the full sense of the word. They saw themselves as a necessary link in the chain of scientific knowledge. Among them were former soldiers, ruined merchants, and simply desperate people whom life had driven into a corner. The work was hard, dirty, and dangerous, but it offered freedom and money that one could not dream of in a factory. The personality of the surgeon in this story is also full of contradictions. Great names in medicine, such as Sir Astley Cooper, whose portraits adorn the halls of royal colleges, were the main clients of the black market. Cooper openly stated before a parliamentary commission that there was no man whose body he could not obtain if he wished. This was not boasting, but a statement of the fact of the absolute power of money and connections over the sanctity of burial. Surgeons lived a double life. By day they were saviors and enlighteners, and by night they negotiated with people who reeked of stale alcohol and graveyard earth. They paid fines for their suppliers if they were caught by the police, and provided support to their families while the breadwinner was in prison. This was a symbiosis of the aristocracy of intellect and the lower strata of society, bound by a common secret. The story of the Irish giant Charles Byrne added particular drama to the situation. This man, suffering from gigantism, was a celebrity during his lifetime and was terribly afraid that after his death, his body would fall into the hands of anatomists. He bequeathed to be buried in a lead coffin and thrown into the sea. However, the famous surgeon John Hunter, obsessed with the idea of acquiring the giant's skeleton for his collection, bribed the funeral team with an enormous sum for those times, £500 sterling. Byrne's body was intercepted on its way to the sea, delivered to Hunter's laboratory, and boiled in a huge cauldron. The giant's skeleton still stands in the museum, serving as a silent reproach to the ethics of science, which placed the desire for knowledge above a person's right to peace. The ideological conflict permeating this era extended far beyond medicine. It was a clash between materialism and spirituality, a utilitarian approach to man and a sacred attitude towards the individual. For the anatomist, the body was a mechanism, a complex machine that needed to be disassembled to understand its working principle. For the common person, the body was the temple of the soul, made in the image and likeness of God. Dissection was perceived as the destruction of the personality, as the ultimate annihilation of a human being. Moreover, the class conflict was vividly manifested here. The rich could buy protection even after death, while the bodies of the poor, orphans, and workhouse inhabitants were practically defenseless against the anatomical knife. This created a sense of deep social injustice. The poor suffered not only during life but were also deprived of peace after its completion. Tension in society grew with each passing year. Newspapers were full of headlines about plundered graves, crowds gathered at anatomy schools, ready to tear them down brick by brick. Surgeons had to hire guards and build secret exits from their buildings. But the real turning point occurred when the lust for profit pushed body suppliers to cross the final line. If before they waited for the natural end of life, now some decided to speed up this process. The story of William Burke and William Hare in Edinburgh became that pivotal moment that forever changed the attitude towards the profession of the resurrectionist. Burke and Hare were not professional grave robbers. They ran a lodging house, and it all started almost by accident when one of their lodgers died, owing them money for rent. To compensate for their losses, they decided to sell his body to Dr. Robert Knox, a well-known anatomist. Receiving a generous reward and realizing how easily money could be made, they decided not to wait for the next opportunity but to create it themselves. Their victims were lonely travelers, the sick, the elderly, and women of easy virtue, people whose disappearance would not be immediately noticed. Their method was terrifyingly simple and effective. They plied the victim with alcohol until unconscious, then suffocated them by pressing their full weight on the chest and covering the mouth and nose with their hands. This method left no signs of violence on the body, which was ideal for anatomical purposes. Doctors needed _0_ specimens. Within a few months, they supplied Dr. Knox with 16 bodies. The doctor himself and his assistants probably suspected the criminal origin of the goods. The bodies were too fresh. They showed no signs of prolonged illness or the, one smell characteristic of exhumed corpses. But no questions were asked. Gold changed hands, and the conveyor belt continued to operate. The end of this terrible series was brought about by the criminals' carelessness and the vigilance of neighbors, who discovered the body of the last victim under the bed in Burke's room. The trial of Burke and Hare in 1828 shocked all of Britain. Hare made a deal with the prosecution and testified against his partner, saving his own life. Burke was sentenced to the death penalty, and ironically, his body was handed over for public dissection. The history of the Resurrectionists is a mirror reflecting humanity's eternal dilemma. How much are we willing to pay for progress, and who exactly will pay that price? The answer to this question has never been simple. The shadows of the past remind us that behind every achievement of civilization lies not only the genius of the pioneer, but also the silent sacrifice of those whose names have been erased from memory, but whose flesh became the foundation for the temple of science. And while we enjoy the fruits of medicine, we unwittingly become heirs to this complex, painful, and contradictory legacy, originating in the fog of 19th-century London cemeteries.